and thanks for the introduction, as well as thank you to Africa Arena, right, for the partnership. We've been working with you on the ground, on the continent for some time, in many, many different hubs, and we look forward to continuing doing that with you. So as you rightfully said, you pronounced my name really well. My name is Itxaso. I lead the startup business for France, Southern Europe, excuse me, Turkey, Middle East, and Africa. We had, under my team as well, and my leadership, the first team at AWS dedicated solely for Africa. Right? We created that many years ago, so I'm glad to share my experience with all of you. And one thing that I like to say about Africa is the only geography that I work with that keeps me extremely humble every time because of the opportunity, the scale, and the learnings, right, on a daily basis. Happy to share a couple of things with you today. There you go. A quick note for a couple of you, because I don't think you know this, and this is connected to a point that was mentioned in the panel before, which goes about the technology that's been developed in the continent. And we have a really good example. So here you can see that in 2006, EC2, pretty much our computing service, which is the bread and butter of any cloud computing service in the world, was developed in South Africa by engineers in South Africa. And we took that and scaled that to the world. Right? So that is a development that happened there on the ground in Cape Town by engineers from Cape Town, from South Africa, for the world. And this is one of the main services, right, that we all use nowadays, and also kick-started cloud computing in the world. Right? So there are many examples like this, but I think this one connects perfectly with the point that we mentioned before. Fast forward to a couple of more things. We do have a big office in Cape Town. You can see the development of AWS on the ground. And one of the things that you didn't see on the slide is that we opened our Nigerian office this year in Lagos as well. So we continue to invest and open more offices on the ground. And I also look forward to continuing this timeline, right, in a couple of years. On the startup team, on my team, so people who work with startups and tech founders, we do have people also on the ground, right? And those people also come from African countries, most notably from the Big Four that we mentioned before. Some numbers to this, right? And this is not only about AWS, but this is an illustration for all of you of what this means for the African continent. When you come in with a company like ours, with cloud, you can see the economic impact directly, right, on the GDP of a country. In this case, is South Africa, but also in the long run. So you can see, one, job creation as well, and these are the number of jobs that we expect to create by 2029. That's also another impact that we expect on GDP by 2029 in South Africa in particular. And there are many more things that you can have a look at to see the actual numbers and the value that we bring to the South African economy in this impact report that you can find online. You just Google AWS Impact Report Africa and you can see this. It's just one example of the things that companies like ours bring to the continent and will continue to do so. One important point as well, because we keep talking about startups, is the number of startups that was enabled. Right now, the number is growing at 2,600 companies, and we continue to invest in those startups across the continent. We are country agnostic. So let's look into Africa. You saw these numbers before in another form, but let me pause here, because it's a really important one to have a look at. This is the development from 2015 until now in Africa when it comes to investments. We only see 2 pointers, right? One is the number of rounds and the total value. Both of them, that growth from 2015 to 2022 is higher than the European average. So when we talk about leapfrogging, acceleration, this is what acceleration looks like. I do understand, and we also mentioned before, that 2023 will be tough, but for many of us, right? But this acceleration puts us in a really, really good point on the continent. And this shows already that we have many startups, and growing from last year, that can pitch and know how to, right, raise those funds. And those exact people will help us to train the next ones. A couple more numbers. We also talked about the Big Four before. I'm showing you exactly the same Big Four, right? South Africa, Nigeria, Egypt, and Kenya. True that we can also see Ghana there, but I'd like to mention also Senegal, right? And the good things are happening there too, which are accelerating year on year too. A couple more things that apart from looking at tier 2 countries and helping those is one more point that we mentioned before, education and training and the number of developers. It's no coincidence that the big hubs like Cairo, Lagos, and Cape Town have the highest number of developers, and we need to continue, right, to train those people, because otherwise we're going to be facing a very big challenge, right, going forward. But the talent is there, and the numbers back that. So briefly on the female part, right, of this equation, which we mentioned briefly in passing, but it's a really important one, not because of inequality only, but because also we are missing on a really, really big opportunity for the continent and for the economic impact of the continent. So I like this slide. It's not the prettiest slide of all of them, but it shows you a couple of things that everyone should know. So if we look at startups funded in 2022, you can see that 20% of them have at least one woman in the founding team. 20%. If we look at the total number, obviously the total percentage declines, right, from 21.5 to 20%, because also investments increased, right? But that's a really good development, right, in a really good path, 20%. Right now, if you look at the bottom, and then I have another stat for you too, Europe or the Western world is nowhere near that number. So when we talk about female representation, we should be looking at Africa, right? Not the other way around. And that's an important one to have a look at. Second thing is, only $1 of all the invested dollars versus 25 are directed to women versus men. So you can see already the huge opportunity that we have if we try to bridge that gap and accelerate that, right, when it comes to female entrepreneurs and funding female entrepreneurs. The Big Four, I think we need to be much more, I'm gonna even say ruthless and in hard with the Big Four and the representation of women on the Big Four. And the clear one that's lagging right now, excuse me, is Egypt with 13.7. I'm glad to see Kenya there, I'm glad to see South Africa and Nigeria as well, but Egypt is the one lagging, and I think we should pay a close attention to that. We can ask more for the countries that have more, right? And the last two slides, what you can see here is that there's a clear mismatch between what's happening in the continent overall in the economy and also the startup funding. What this means is, and this is a stat from the Central Bank of Africa, 25% of all businesses in Africa are either run or started by women. 25, 1 in 4. Let that sink. In Europe and the Western world, we're nowhere near that, right? But as you can see, the representation of founders who get investment in the startup world, it's nowhere near that either, right? So we have some work to do. And the last one is one of my favorite stats because it shows you already the economic impact of women-led businesses, which is tangible and very tangible for the continent. If we don't grasp that, if we don't accelerate that, we're going to be missing on economic growth for Africa overall, not only for women, but overall. Two more things to look at. So if you look at the verticals where the funding is going to, we mentioned fintech before, we mentioned agriculture as well in passing, education too. What you see here is that the main difference between all male, mixed or female is that for those startups with at least one woman founder, the vast majority of the investment and the delta is that it goes to education startups as well as agriculture. That's the biggest delta in the total funding. Versus, yes, they are represented in fintech, but much less than the all-male ones. And we talked about the big opportunity that we see in fintech in the next 5 years. So we need to look at where are the sectors where we see more women, where are the sectors that are getting most funding. And you see a clear mismatch. So two things, right? I wanted to make sure that I also point out at the main obstacles. We measure what the main obstacles are with dollar value, and we also measure what the opportunity is for the continent and what we are missing. Again, this is about inequality, yes, but it's also about a missed opportunity for growth for the whole African continent. So if you look at the first one, and I think that's a staggering one, there's a 42 billion gap, right, in investment currently, and that means from companies started, run by at least one woman founder, right, and the investment gap, that is the data that we're pulling. This is a World Economic Forum giving us this data sources, right, and these data points. Two, what I said before, key sectors, especially fintech, who is harnessing the most part of the investment value and rounds, women are underrepresented there. We do have notable examples and exceptions. Just to mention one, Pivo, for example, which is a really good one, run by two female founders, Y Combinator, and many more, but not enough, right? I can give you 20 names of fintech companies run by men, and then many, many less run by women. And the last one is, and we mentioned that also in the panel in passing, is that women normally go for other sources of financing, right? Because it's extremely hard to access money in the continent, specifically for women, right? And we're looking at grants, we're looking at different schemes that women are trying to access and normally access versus males. Two more points about the opportunity in the continent. That number, I think it's fairly surprising. So if we continue down this path in Africa, it will take 140 years to reach parity. 140. If we look at the GDP impact, we're looking at 316 billion to be gained on GDP, right, on the continent, if we tackle the gender gap issue. And the last one is my personal opinion, and I believe many share this here. I think entrepreneurship will reach and bridge this gap. Starting companies, accelerating companies, being operators in companies, that is the biggest opportunity for the continent. If you think about the stat I showed before, 25% of companies were started or run by at least one woman. That's already a really, really big number. We need to double down on that to bridge the gender gap. Two more things. So briefly on what we do is a very brief introduction. We're doing a couple of things, right? So as AWS, as I told you before, we do have offices on the ground. We do have our data region also on the ground in Cape Town. But we are launching a couple of programs dedicated to females and also dedicated to African founders. One of the most exciting ones that we have is that we pledged globally to train 21 million people. When it comes to Africa, we deliver that through 21 programs in 21 African countries. We have one per each of those 21 countries. So I couldn't agree more with the panel before, talking about education, education and education. This program aims at training anyone who wants to sign up at no cost for cloud skills in Africa. It's on the ground. Well, we do many more things, but one of the things I'd like to mention specifically for startups is that we do have a team solely dedicated, right, to looking at programs, funding, resources that we need across the globe for those founders that are normally typically underrepresented. We do have a big focus on Africa, right, and specifically on my team. And the last one is, this is also something that I do myself. I do one-on-one mentoring sessions, right, with early-stage female founders. I'm talking about those with no investments raised, right? Because that's the most critical part. And I'm not the only one in the company. Right? One quick one with Africa Arena, right? We do have this challenge with Africa Arena, which is only for female founders on the ground. You can see that there's a cash prize and so many more things that you can access to. So if you would like to know more about this, do you know someone who should go through this program, reach out to me or Africa Arena directly, right? This is something that we are launching with Africa Arena alone, dedicated to female founders in Africa. So we're doing many more things, but I wanted to show you this one today as well. And last but not least, I was asked for advice, right, for female founders in Africa. And these are my points, the ones that I would raise, right? The first one is work on your network. I know this sounds obvious, but this is the most important one and the one that I've seen that changes the game, right? And when I say network, you'll know LinkedIn, you know Reddit, you can be on GitHub. There are so many different channels to reach out to people. I get those reach outs. I reach out also proactively to people. This is the most important thing on the ground. Because as a couple of you said before, many people in Africa are in many other countries which are not the big four, right? And have a fantastic idea and are already, right, running a small business, right? We all need to get used to reaching out to people and answering those questions. Think about your network. Number two, and this is the reality, female founders pay it forward. Female founders, statistically speaking, hire more women. And this is the stats. Stats are stubborn, right? So if that's the truth, and if you know that that's happening, and you are a female founder, do target those female founders and those female investors as well first. Not only, but do that, and do that homework to increase your chances. And three, get trained. It can be with us, with someone else. There are many more schemes on the ground, but do get trained, because in many occasions, the people that reach out to me have a very simple question, which is a key question. I don't have the right education, I don't have the right title, I don't have the right stamp, and I don't have the right skills. How do I bridge all of those things? Some of them do have the skills, don't have the right stamp. Get trained, get that stamp, right? Get that stamp from a certified place. It could be AWS, it could be another one, right? But get that, because that is one of the things that people, when they talk to you, they will be looking at. That's the stubborn truth as well. Our next one is the global investors. We mentioned that before, but this is extremely important for Africa. There are many active investors in Africa, but there are many global investors who don't know how to invest in Africa. Right? They're looking at Africa, but they don't know. Do think globally. Right? Do think global. Don't be thinking only about your local investors also, but do think globally. Right? I had this stat from 2022, which says that 80% of the total funding, right, dollar value, that went to Africa comes from outside Africa. We need to improve that, because we need to improve the number of African investors investing in Africa, 100%. But it is the reality right now. Think globally. Right? There are many, many resources. We mentioned a couple before. I can mention many more. Get to those resources. Think about those investors. Think about the connections of those investors. That information is online nowadays. And the last one is crafting the story. Right? And this is a basic one, but one that will help you big time. And crafting a story means you might not be 100% sure about your vision and mission, but get your vision and get your execution ready. Right? You need to be able to tell a compelling story with an execution plan fairly quickly in a really, really simple way. Right? And that's the one that I will double down on. Right? Make sure. Because in many occasions, when I talk to entrepreneurs, they tell me, these are my 5 scenarios. Absolutely, you do. Simplify that a lot. Simplify. Because what I see outside, specifically with global investors thinking about investing in Africa, is that you need to make this simple for them. Right? For many of them, Africa is a huge continent, they don't know much about it. Make it very, very simple and clear. I'm going to pause there. And I would like to have any questions that you may have, or otherwise, I'm going to remove myself from lunch and this panel, because I'm sure everyone is hungry. But happy to take any questions that you may have.
Yes. Brilliant presentation. Love what you do. So female founders are often over-mentored and undercapitalized, right? So the training is important, but we also have to have the honest conversation about where's the money. And part of that is that there's not enough female at investment decision-making processes. Yeah. So there aren't enough fund managers, etc. So how are you thinking about your value chain? Obviously, you're doing really good work at the female founder, but there's female investment committee members that needs to be added to these funds. There's female fund managers like Chanel. There's female decision makers at the DFIs. And I almost think that AWS, because of a global power, can use soft influence to influence all of that. So are you thinking about the value chain?
Absolutely. And I agree with you, right? There are unfortunately not many people like Chanel right now. We need more. And there's another point I would mention before answering your question, is that what I've seen globally, not particularly in Africa, but what I've seen globally, is that many companies founded by females who then go and only target female investors have a lower chance of succeeding, right? Which is unfortunate, but it's also the truth, right? So yes, so to your question about self-influencing, we need to do much more, right? So I'm really happy to hear some ideas because it's a serious matter and we need to double down on this one. But we need to think about the whole network. So one, female investors. Second, board members of those companies or in other companies influencing that. We don't have enough females there either. And third, and you mentioned that before, also fundraising for those funds when you have also a lead investor or partner, it's challenging and it's more challenging, right? So it's challenging on both ends, on the investor side and on the female founder side. So one thing that we do is we do create pitching sessions only for females with top funds, right, across the globe. We do that. One of the last ones that we did was in Paris, and we also invited some African founders as well, so French-speaking African country, startups. But I think we need to do much more in that direction. You need to create an environment where you have top investors obliged to see the pitches of female founders. And I'm pretty bullish on that one. I think you need to create that and only put those investors, those startups in front of those investors. I don't think there's any way around that. Anyone else? Yes, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Kave, and I'm the founder of Talent Diverse. We help companies hire female talent and also BIPOC talent here in Berlin. And I'm also the organizer of Black in Tech Berlin. And last month in May, we had an event on Africa Day, and we were talking about how we can build bridges between the diaspora and the continent and how we can influence this power that we have here on the motherland. And I wanted to ask you if you have an idea how we could use the power of female African diaspora to actually push more checks onto the continent or just build bridges between the African female founders on the continent and female diasporas here in Europe or wherever.
It's a really good point. And if I'm not mistaken, the biggest diaspora in Europe of African founders is in London, right now.
We're coming too.
And Berlin upcoming. Hopefully, we will just surpass them soon. I'm based in Berlin, by the way. So that being said, we also have, and I also have a team member in London for that exact reason, right? So we are aware of where the diaspora is. But to your point, I think there are two things. So one, we need to give visibility of those 25% females with businesses on the continent. We need to give visibility to people on the continent first, right? And then second, we also need to do exactly the same thing in the main hubs, right? I think we need to start telling the story and include myself and our company as well in that to help you bring the visibility to that diaspora. If we're thinking about London and Berlin, and that's where the stats are, we need to be doing something targeted in those diasporas, right? To your question about what do we do with those companies or those female, African females who are in, let's say, European cities as a diaspora, I think we need to think about the agenda of investors. ESG, right? All of them have goals, all of them, right? And we need to be very tactical, right? I'm not saying that's the only solution, but if we think about what's on their agenda, ESG, what are the goals that they have? Again, I'll go back to what I said before. We need to put those people in those diasporas in front of those investors. And I do know that the vast majority of top investors in Europe do have ESG goals. Same for Germany. Happy to give you some pointers there too.
I'd love to. Thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else? Any other question? Okay, thank you very much.